5 million tons. Erased. Not by bombers, not by battleships, by 300 machines you've never seen in a history book. While Pearl Harbor burned and photographers captured Marines planting flags, the real war happened in darkness 300 feet down, and it starved an empire to death. 1,300 Japanese ships sent to the bottom, that's every cargo vessel serving the entire United Kingdom, destroyed 3 times over. Oil stopped flowing, rice stopped arriving, factories went silent, and here's the part that'll make you pause. By 1945, Japanese civilians were consuming 1,500 calories a day. Starvation level. Not from bombs, from missing cargo. So, why don't your textbooks mention this? Because submarine warfare doesn't photograph well. No iconic flag raisings. No mushroom clouds. Just oil slicks, penciled logbooks, and a casualty rate so brutal the Navy classified it for decades. The loudest war got the headlines. The silent one decided the outcome. This is the story of how America committed what Japan called a war crime, and called it strategy. Stay with me for the next 10 minutes, because what you're about to see changes everything you thought you knew about who actually won the Pacific. The 7th of December, 1941. Pearl Harbor erupts. Sirens claw at a sky gone black with smoke. Battleships list and burn. Oil blooms across the harbor like a dark rainbow, slick and shimmering under a sun that now feels wrong. Bodies float. The Pacific Fleet is broken. Radios from Tokyo to Berlin crackle the same message. The Empire Ascendant. The war's verdict delivered in a single morning. But beneath the fire, in colder water 300 feet down where sunlight dies and pressure squeezes steel, another kind of weapon is already stirring. No photographers will capture this. No stadium cheering audience will know its name. A force that won't conquer islands or reduce cities to ash, but will do something colder and more final. It will starve an empire. And the twist is brutal. Japan won the loud morning, but never saw the silent night coming. In 60 seconds, you'll understand why Admiral Chester Nimitz called this the greatest military victory in history, and why it's absent from every history class you ever sat through. When we picture the Pacific War, we see the iconic frames. Marines inching up volcanic sand at Iwo Jima, carrier decks slick with aviation fuel and danger, city-sized mushroom clouds that remade the planet. That's the loud war, the one that photographs well and makes museum posters. But there's a second story that unfolded where cameras couldn't go and microphones couldn't hear. A campaign fought in darkness, logged in pencil, and measured by missing cargo, grounded planes, and quiet factories. This war had no iconic images, just mathematics. Tonnage subtracted, calories denied. A slow-motion strangulation that proved more devastating than every strategic bombing raid combined. Don't blink, because the footage you never saw decides the outcome you thought you knew. The bombs got the credit. The submarines did the killing. And in the next 60 seconds, we'll pull the thread that unravels the Empire's sweater. Japan's problem wasn't courage or engineering. It was arithmetic. The nation's ambitions outran its resources. Oil at home? Scarce. Rubber? Imported. Bauxite? Tin? Copper? High-grade iron ore for mass production? Largely shipped in from abroad. Before the war, as much as 4/5 of Japan's oil flowed from the United States, fuel for ships and planes that would soon fire at Americans. When Washington closed the spigot in mid-1941, Tokyo faced a countdown. Seize Southeast Asia's resource basins before the tanks ran dry, or retreat from dreams of empire. They had maybe 18 months of fuel left. The clock was ticking. The choice was speed. In months, Japanese forces sprawled across thousands of miles to refineries, plantations, mines, Borneo, Malaya, the Dutch East Indies, the Philippines. On paper, the material problem was solved. Tokyo celebrated their stunning victories. In practice, a trap had sprung shut. Acquiring assets is easy. Sustaining, transporting, and protecting them across oceans is the hard part. Pin that thought. We're about to stress test the bottleneck that decides everything. Trace the empire's lifelines on a map, and you'll feel your pulse quicken. Oil from Borneo and Sumatra pushing north through the South China Sea. Rice and staples from Southeast Asia. Rubber from Malaya. Iron ore from the Philippines and beyond. Thousands of miles, narrow straits. Choke points laid out like tripwires. Luzon Strait, the Formosa coast, the approaches to the home islands. If an empire has a bloodstream, these routes were the arteries. Every tanker, every freighter, every transport became a red blood cell with a destination and a deadline. 2,000 miles from the oil fields of Borneo to the refineries in Japan, every drop of fuel, every ton of rice, every pound of rubber, all of it traveling across vast expanses of water where depth swallowed light and sound died quickly, and in the darkness below, knives were being sharpened. The U.S. submarine force charted these flows, learned their rhythms, and prepared to cut where it would hurt most. The question wasn't if they would strike, it was how devastating the bleeding would be. Coming up in 30 seconds. The first great mistake that almost neutered that plan, and how desperation turned it into a lethal edge. You're a submarine skipper in 1942. 3 weeks at sea. The air tastes like metal and sweat. You've tracked a fat tanker for days, maneuvered silently into position 500 yards, textbook angle. The target fills your periscope like a billboard. Fire 1, fire 2, fire 3. 3 pale wakes rush true, each a promise. You hear the metallic thunks of impact, direct hits, and then nothing. No detonation, no fire. The tanker steams on, indifferent, while your crew stares at you in disbelief. Your torpedoes just bounced off like rubber balls. This wasn't rare. It was routine. Early war. Mark 14 torpedoes ran too deep, passing harmlessly under enemy ships. Their magnetic exploders popped early or failed completely. Even perfect hits often didn't detonate. Some patrols saw malfunction rates that climbed toward 60%. 60%. The bureaucracy onshore said, aim better. The men underwater broke rules instead. They deactivated magnetic exploders against orders, set shallower runs than the manual allowed, jury-rigged contact pistols with files and fury. Hold that failure rate in your head because when the fix finally comes, the curve doesn't bend. It snaps. Here's the pivot most viewers miss. On day 1 of the war, the 7th of December 1941, the U.S. quietly authorized unrestricted submarine warfare against Japan. No press conference. Just orders. Any Japanese ship, warship or merchant was fair game. The exact same tactic Germany used in World War I. The tactic America condemned as barbaric. The justification America used to enter that war. Now, America embraced it without hesitation. War had become total, and survival was everything. By early 1943, the torpedo problems were finally, officially acknowledged and fixed. Working Mark 14 seconds slid into racks. New electric Mark 18 seconds arrived wakeless, harder to detect. Air and surface radar matured, night tactics tightened. Then came the brain, intelligence. American code breakers at Hypo and Frupak repeatedly cracked Japanese naval and merchant codes, enough to learn convoy routes, timings, and cargoes far more often than chance allowed. Think poker with your opponent's cards showing just enough to know when to bet big. Direction-finding stations triangulated bearings. Submarines took positions days in advance and waited in silence. Hunting became certainty. Execution became scheduled. And that's when the dominoes fall. First up, the one liquid modern war cannot live without. Oil is muscle in motion. Japan seized wells in the Dutch East Indies and kept them producing millions of barrels per month, even under occupation constraints. Peak production hit 4 million barrels monthly in 1943, but output at the wellhead doesn't power a ship unless it crosses thousands of miles of contested ocean and survives to reach a tank farm in Japan. Even in 1943, imports arriving in the home islands rarely topped about 1.4 million barrels per month. Where did the rest go? Into orange flame and black slicks. Every tanker that lumbered north through the South China Sea became priority prey. Slow, high value, and hard to escort across an ocean the enemy owned at depth. American submarines hunted oil tankers with special ferocity because they carried the empire's lifeblood. By 1945, oil imports had all but stopped. Not slowed, stopped. The physics of fuel. Shortage rippled outward. The Imperial Navy's mighty battleships, including the legendary Yamato, sat anchored in port, unable to sortie not because they were damaged, but because there was no fuel. Aircraft carriers sat idle. Planes sat grounded at airfields across the empire. Pilot training was slashed to almost nothing to conserve fuel. New pilots received maybe 50 hours of flight time before being thrown into combat against American veterans with 300-plus hours of training. You've heard of the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, June 1944. Roughly 600 Japanese planes downed, 3 carriers lost. Superior U.S. training and radar mattered. Remember that cause behind, we'll come back to it in a minute. This is the part most histories skip, because it isn't cinematic. It's human. Japan couldn't feed itself from domestic fields alone. It relied on calories shipped in, rice from Korea, Taiwan, and Southeast Asia, staples and fish from across the region. 20% of Japan's food supply came by sea. As ships vanished, so did meals. By 1945, estimates of average daily intake in Japanese cities hovered around 1,500 calories below the basic needs of an adult body. Children stopped growing. Students fainted in classrooms from hunger. Factory workers collapsed at their stations, unable to maintain production on starvation rations. Every freighter that failed to dock showed up as a missing inch of growth in a child. Every cargo of rice sunk at sea ended as fainting spells on factory floors. The black market exploded. A single sweet potato cost a month's wages. People sold family heirlooms for bags of rice. Ration cards stiffened. Government slogans urged citizens to eat until they were 80% full, to stretch barley with acorns, to substitute and endure. Here's the brutal arithmetic. You can't ration what never makes landfall. You can't distribute what's on the seabed. And the submarine force knew what some ships carried because manifests and intelligence flagged cargoes, rice included. They logged the hits and kept going. Total War asks wicked questions. The commanders answered with the mission they'd been given. Choke the arteries until the heart stops. Stay with me, because the last domino shows how a starving home front and an idle fleet feed a third collapse. War runs on ore, chemicals, and rubber as surely as it runs on bravery. Japan's factories needed steady inputs: iron ore, bauxite for aluminum, tin, copper, rubber shipped in from conquered territories along routes the enemy now haunted. Interrupt the flow at sea, and assembly lines go hungry. By 1945, post-war analyses estimate Japan's industrial output in key sectors collapsed, on the order of 60 to 70% from earlier peaks. Aircraft production cratered. Shipbuilding faltered to a crawl. Ammunition plants fell behind demand they could no longer meet. Synthetic substitutes were tried. They couldn't bridge the gap. The famed Zero fighters of 1942 terrorized the Pacific. By 1945, replacements lagged, not for lack of design but for lack of material. The loop was vicious. No oil meant fewer training hours. which meant pilots who couldn't protect convoys, which meant fewer cargoes, which meant fewer parts, which meant fewer planes to defend anything. Don't blink, this is where the curve breaks. In a moment, we'll line up the numbers that tell the story clean, then show you the names that make those numbers sting. Let's volley the data. By war's end, American submarines had sunk on the order of 1,300 Japanese merchant ships, roughly 5 million tons of cargo capacity, amounting to about 55% of all Japanese merchant tonnage destroyed. Japan's merchant marine shrank from around 6 million tons pre-war to well under 2 million by 1945. Oil imports dwindled to a trickle, and then to nothing. Food imports plunged 75%. Raw material inflows fell in some categories by upwards of 80%. Industrial output in critical sectors collapsed by roughly 2/3. Now, anchor those numbers to names. The USS Tang, a legend with 33 ships sunk, lost when her own torpedo curved back. Her survivors captured. Commander Richard O'Kane, Medal of Honor. The USS Harder hit M. Harder, 5 destroyers in a handful of days. Commander Sam Dealey, Medal of Honor, awarded posthumously. The USS Archerfish stalking the 72,000-ton Shinano, Japan's largest aircraft carrier, on her maiden voyage and sending the giant down. If you thought the ending belonged to island hopping alone or to bombers alone, wait for the official postscript. The U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey called the submarine blockade the single most decisive factor in the collapse of the Japanese economy. Admiral Chester Nimitz's line, "The greatest military victory in history," wasn't chest-thumping. It was arithmetic. A quick nod to nuance. Allied mining in 1945. Operation Starvation tightened the noose. British and Dutch subs and air and surface forces took their share. But the continuous spine of strangulation from the first patrols to the last log entries was U.S. submarines. Hold that synthesis. The cost is next, and it's steep. About 16,000 Americans served in submarines during World War II. Roughly 3,500 never came home, around a 22% casualty rate. The highest proportion of any major U.S. branch. 52 submarines were lost. In many cases, every soul aboard went with the boat. Imagine the inside of a submarine under attack. The air goes thick and hot as batteries labor. A sonarman whispers screw counts and bearing lines. Above, destroyers fan out. Sharper pings of active sonar lock in. Then the charges start dropping. They thump the water like thrown stones, then come the blasts. The hull groans. A bulb pops and darkness eats. The room before red battle lights restore a thin glow. Pipes bead sweat. Bolts creak. Men lie still, counting seconds between detonations, because distance is the difference between a violent shudder and a fatal crack. Sometimes it lasts not minutes, but hours. Depth charge patterns across a half day, the clock stretching mean and slow. When it ends, if it ends, the boat scrapes the bottom and waits for night to climb toward air again. Some submarines endured depth charge attacks for 18 consecutive hours, 18 hours of waiting in darkness while explosions tried to kill you. So why don't you know this story by heart? 3 reasons. First, secrecy. Submarine operations were classified during the war, while carrier battles splashed across papers. Second, invisibility. The silent war doesn't photograph well, no iconic flag raising, just oil slicks and logbooks. Third, modesty. Many submariners came home, hung up the uniform, and didn't tell their story loudly. The story faded into classified files and modest silence. Which brings us to the lesson that didn't stay in the past, and why you'll want to keep watching for the next 60 seconds. The undersea campaign rewired strategy. It proved viscerally that control of sea lanes can decide wars, even if you never smash the enemy's battle fleet head-on. It validated economic warfare at sea. Sink the cargoes and the factories slow. Slow the factories and the armies stall. It vindicated investment in submarines, sensors, code breaking, and logistics analysis. And here's the part that flips this forward. The artery map still matters. Japan remains a maritime nation dependent on energy and materials arriving by ship, as do many powers today. The routes and tech have changed, but the logic hasn't. Protect your lifelines, or someone will learn their rhythm and cut them. The U.S. Navy draws a straight line from those diesel boats to today's nuclear fleet. For exactly that reason, allies drill to guard choke points. Rivals study maps for vulnerabilities. The enemy in 1942 wasn't foolish. Japan built convoys, Kaibokan escorts, and air ASW units and laid mines, but it started late and short on radar, sonar, fuel, and training time. American boats arrived mid-war with better torpedoes, better sensors, better shore support, and an intelligence picture that often turned patrols into ambushes scripted days in advance. That architecture doctrine, tech, intel, logistics, is the blueprint for maritime advantage now. So we return to the opening inversion, and it lands heavier the second time. 300 or so boats. 16,000 men. A war fought mostly out of sight, in tubes that smelled of oil and effort, by crews who slept beside torpedoes and woke to concussions. They targeted the foundation, not the facade. They didn't plant flags. They cut arteries and waited for physiology to finish the job. The empire bled out. The war bent. And when the emperor spoke of a new and most cruel bomb in August 1945, it gave a face to a surrender already written in missing tonnage, silent factories, and ration cards. Honor the people who made that true, the silent service. Men who held still in the dark and kept their hands steady while the world tried to shake them apart. Their story hums under modern strategy, and it deserves to be remembered. If you thought you knew how this war was won, now you know the part that changes everything. Keep on screen as you close. 16,000 U.S. submariners served in the Pacific. About 22% did not return. 52 U.S. submarines were lost, many with all hands. To 1,300 Japanese merchant ships, sunk about 5 million tons. Submarines destroyed roughly 55% of Japan's merchant tonnage. The silent service never forgotten.